Virginia Woolf walked into a river with stones in her pockets on March 28, 1941. She was 59 years old, one of the most celebrated writers in the English language, and absolutely certain she was losing her mind. The note she left her husband began with, "Dearest, I feel certain that I am going mad again. Not might be, not worried about, certain." This wasn't her first breakdown, and she knew the pattern well enough to recognize what was coming. What's strange is that the woman who revolutionized how we think about consciousness, who gave us stream of thought as a literary technique, who wrote some of the most psychologically acute novels ever published, spent her entire life battling a mind that wouldn't stay still. The same mental turbulence that eventually killed her also made her work possible. She was born Adeline Virginia Stephen on January 25, 1882, in South Kensington, London. The house at 22 Hyde Park Gate was crowded, chaotic, filled with the particular intensity that comes from blending two families into one. Her father, Leslie Stephen, was an eminent Victorian man of letters, the first editor of the Dictionary of National Biography, a historian, an author, and somehow also one of the premier mountaineers of his generation. Her mother, Julia Princeps Stephen, had been born in India, served as a model for pre-Raphaelite painters, worked as a nurse, and wrote a book on nursing that was actually published. Both had been married before. Julia's first husband, Herbert Duckworth, had died young, leaving her with 3 children, George, Stella, and Gerald. Leslie's first marriage to Minnie Thackeray produced one daughter, Laura. Together, Leslie and Julia had 4 more children, Vanessa, Thoby, Virginia, and Adrian. 8 children total in a Victorian household where the rules were strict but unevenly applied. The boys went to school, the girls did not. This would matter later, obviously, but at the time it was simply how things worked. Virginia's education happened at home, scattered and intense, built around unrestricted access to her father's library. By age 5, she was writing letters. By 10, she'd started an illustrated family newspaper called the Hyde Park Gate News, documenting the daily dramas of the Stephen household with the earnestness only a child can muster. She was already watching, already taking notes, already turning life into narrative. The family spent summers at Talland House in St Ives, a beach town at the southwestern tip of England. The house looked out over Porthminster Bay. You could see the God-Rivi Lighthouse from there, standing offshore like a sentinel. Decades later, Virginia would build an entire novel around that lighthouse, around the summers in St Ives, around the particular quality of light on water, and the way memory transforms ordinary moments into something luminous. She remembered those summers with extraordinary fondness, the kind that suggests they represented something precious that ended too soon, which they did. Everything changed in 1895 when Virginia was 13. Her mother died suddenly at age 49. The cause was rheumatic fever, though that's almost beside the point. What mattered was that Julia Stephen, the centre around which the household revolved, was gone. Virginia stopped writing the family newspaper. She had her first mental breakdown that spring, the first documented episode of an illness that would shadow her entire life. Modern psychiatrists looking at her symptoms would likely diagnose bipolar disorder, though the Victorians had different names for it, most of them useless. She was barely recovering when her half-sister Stella died in 1897 at 28. Virginia wrote in her diary that it was impossible to write of. 2 years, 2 deaths, 2 women who had provided stability and warmth suddenly absent. The house at Hyde Park Gate became a different place, darker and more oppressive. Her father, already prone to Victorian melancholy and self-absorption, grew worse. And then there was the other thing, the thing Virginia would only write about decades later in her memoir, A Sketch of the Past. Her half-brothers, George and Gerald Duckworth, sexually abused her. The abuse lasted years. We don't know the full extent because Virginia herself struggled to articulate it, writing around the edges of the trauma, approaching it obliquely. What we do know is that it happened, that it started not long after their mother's death, and that Virginia understood, even then, that something terrible was being done to her. She would spend much of her adult life trying to understand how violation shapes consciousness, how power operates in private spaces, how women's bodies become territories that others feel entitled to claim. Leslie Stephen died in 1904 when Virginia was 22. She had another breakdown, more severe this time. While she was ill, her sister Vanessa took charge and made a decision that would reshape all their lives. They were leaving Hyde Park Gate. The 4 Stephen siblings, Vanessa, Thoby, Virginia, and Adrian, would move to 46 Gordon Square in Bloomsbury. This was radical. Young unmarried women didn't simply set up house without chaperones in Edwardian England. Vanessa did it anyway, and Bloomsbury, both the neighbourhood and what it would come to represent, became their new world. Thoby Stephen had gone to Cambridge, where he'd made friends with a group of young men who were brilliant, ambitious, and convinced they were going to change British intellectual life. Leonard Woolf, Clive Bell, Saxon Sidney Turner, Lytton Strachey, Maynard Keynes. They started gathering at Gordon Square on Thursday evenings. The conversations were intense, wide-ranging, deliberately provocative. They talked about art, philosophy, economics, sexuality, everything the Victorian establishment considered settled. Vanessa and Virginia joined these discussions, holding their own, pushing back, contributing ideas that were taken seriously. This was the beginning of what would later be called the Bloomsbury Group, though the people involved never used that term themselves. They were just friends, really, a loose collection of writers, artists, and thinkers who shared certain assumptions about the importance of aesthetics, the primacy of personal relationships, and the necessity of questioning conventional morality. E. M. Forster was part of it. Roger Fry, the art critic who would introduce post-impressionism to England. Duncan Grant, the painter. They were bohemian by Edwardian standards, though they were also mostly from privileged backgrounds, which gave them the freedom to be bohemian in the first place. Virginia started writing professionally around this time. In 1904, she began reviewing for The Guardian, a clerical paper. By 1905, she was writing for the Times literary supplement, which was far more prestigious. She was learning her craft through criticism, training herself to analyse how other writers constructed sentences, built arguments, created effects. The reviews were intelligent and sharp, though she hadn't yet found her own voice as a creative writer. That would take longer. Then in 1906, Thoby died. He was 26. The family had taken a trip to Greece and Thoby contracted typhoid fever. The disease killed him within weeks. Virginia had now lost her mother, her half-sister, her father, and her brother, all before she turned 25. Death wasn't an abstraction. It was a constant presence, arriving without warning, taking the people she loved and leaving her to make sense of the absence. Vanessa married Clive Bell in 1907. Virginia felt the loss acutely, not because she disapproved of the marriage, but because Vanessa had been her anchor, the steady presence who managed practical life, while Virginia wrote and struggled with her mental health. Now Vanessa had her own household, her own marriage, her own concerns. Virginia moved with her brother Adrian to 29 Fitzroy Square, another Bloomsbury address. The Thursday evening gatherings continued, but the dynamic had shifted. Leonard Woolf came back into the picture in 1911. He'd been in Ceylon since 1904, working in the colonial civil service, and he returned on leave. He and Virginia had met before, years earlier, through Thoby. Now they met again as adults, with more defined identities. Leonard was serious, politically engaged, disciplined in ways Virginia was not. He decided fairly quickly that he wanted to marry her. She took longer to decide, wrestling with doubts about marriage itself, about whether she could sustain the kind of intimacy it required, about whether her mental instability made her unsuitable as a wife. She eventually said yes. They married on August 10, 1912, at St Pancras Registry Office. She was 30, he was 31. Leonard resigned from the colonial service, giving up a career that would have taken him far from England, from Virginia, from the literary life she was beginning to build. It was a sacrifice he made consciously, and it shaped everything that followed. The marriage was unusual by any standard. Virginia had little interest in sex, found it distressing rather than pleasurable, and Leonard accepted this. Their relationship was intellectual, companionate, built on shared work and mutual respect rather than physical passion. Whether this arrangement satisfied Leonard is unclear. Whether it satisfied Virginia is equally unclear. What's certain is that they stayed together for nearly 30 years, that Leonard became her primary caretaker during her breakdowns, and that she relied on him in ways she relied on no one else. Just 1 year after the wedding, Virginia attempted suicide. She took a massive dose of veronal, a sedative. Leonard found her in time, got medical help, and she survived. The doctors advised against having children, partly because of her mental health, partly because pregnancy might trigger another breakdown. Virginia found this heartbreaking, despite her ambivalence about motherhood. The choice had been taken from her, and that felt like another loss in a life already marked by too many losses. She'd been working on a novel since 1908. It was originally called Melimbrosia, then The Voyage Out. The writing was difficult, interrupted by illness, revised obsessively. She finished it in 1913, but publication was delayed until 1915 because she had another severe breakdown after her marriage. When the book finally appeared, published by Duckworth and Company, the reviews were respectful but not ecstatic. It was a conventional novel, in many ways the story of a young woman's voyage to South America and her developing consciousness. The prose showed flashes of what Virginia would later achieve, but it was clearly apprentice work. What mattered more than the novel itself was that she'd finished it, proven she could sustain a long narrative, established herself as someone who wrote books rather than just reviews. She was learning what she could do, testing the limits of form and voice. The next novel would be different. The one after that would be different still. She was moving towards something, though she didn't yet know exactly what. In 1917, the Woolfs bought a small hand-printing press for £19. They set it up on the dining room table at Hogarth House in Richmond, where they were living at the time. Printing began as a hobby, something to occupy Virginia's hands when writing became too stressful, a way to give her mind a different kind of work. They taught themselves how to use the press, making mistakes, ruining pages, slowly figuring out the mechanics. Their first publication came in July 1917. 2 stories, one story by Virginia, The Mark on the Wall, one by Leonard, 3 Jews. They printed about 150 copies, bound them by hand, and sold them to friends and acquaintances. It was a tiny operation, almost absurdly modest. But it was also the beginning of the Hogarth Press, which would become one of the most important independent publishers in Britain, releasing work by T.S. Eliot, Catherine Mansfield, Sigmund Freud in translation, and of course Virginia's own novels. Starting small meant they could take risks, publish experimental work that commercial publishers would have rejected, maintain complete artistic control. The war was ending. Virginia was 35 years old. She'd survived multiple breakdowns, published 1 novel, and started a press that would give her the freedom to write exactly what she wanted. What she wanted, it turned out, was to break fiction apart and rebuild it in forms no one had tried before. The experimental work started small. The Mark on the Wall was barely a story in the traditional sense. A narrator notices a mark on the wall and spends the entire piece speculating about what it might be, how it got there, letting her thoughts spiral outward from this tiny detail into meditations on memory, perception, and the nature of reality itself. No plot, no character development in the conventional sense, just consciousness moving, associating, drifting. The reader finally learns what the mark is in the last line, but by then it doesn't matter. The point was never the mark. The point was everything that happened in the mind while looking at it. This was different from anything being published in 1917. Fiction was supposed to tell stories, create characters, build toward climaxes. Virginia was doing something else entirely, trying to capture what it actually felt like to think, to be alive inside a mind that moved in fragments and associations rather than neat linear progressions. She was working toward what would later be called stream of consciousness, though she didn't have a name for it yet. She just knew that traditional narrative felt false to her, that novels like The Voyage Out, with their conventional plots and clear character arcs, weren't capturing what she wanted to capture. The Hogarth Press grew slowly. They published Catherine Mansfield's Prelude in 1918, printed it themselves though it took months. They brought out T.S. Eliot's poems in 1919, a small edition that sold respectably. They were learning the business side, dealing with printers when jobs got too big for their dining room table, figuring out distribution and advertising. Leonard handled most of the practical details. Virginia contributed ideas, read submissions, worked on layouts. The press gave her something the commercial publishing world couldn't: complete freedom to publish exactly what she wanted to write. No editor demanding changes, no publisher worrying about sales. She started her next novel in 1920. Jacob's Room would be her first fully experimental work, abandoning the conventional structure she'd used in The Voyage Out. The novel follows Jacob Flanders from childhood through Cambridge and into young adulthood, but it refuses to give readers direct access to his consciousness. Instead, we see him only through fragments, through other people's perceptions, through objects in his room, through absence. He's the empty centre around which the novel revolves. The technique was radical, frustrating for readers who wanted traditional character development, brilliant in what it suggested about how we can never really know other people, how identity is always constructed from the outside. Writing it was difficult in new ways. Virginia suffered headaches, periods where the work wouldn't come, days when she doubted whether what she was doing made any sense at all, but she pushed through, convinced she was onto something important. The novel was published by the Hogarth Press in October 1922. Reviews were mixed. Some critics recognised the innovation, others were baffled or hostile. Sales were modest, but Virginia knew she'd broken through to something, found a method that could take her further. During these years, the Bloomsbury Group was fully formed. Thursday evenings at Gordon Square, or later at Tavistock Square, became regular gatherings. Lytton Strachey would be there, brilliant and caustic, his biography eminent Victorians having made him famous. John Maynard Keynes, already influential in economics, arguing about policy and aesthetics with equal intensity. E.M. Forster, whose novels Virginia admired even as she pushed beyond what he was doing. Roger Fry, the art critic, who'd introduced post-impressionism to Britain, talking about Cézanne and visual form in ways that influenced how Virginia thought about literary structure. Vanessa, painting, raising children, creating a life that balanced art and domesticity in ways Virginia both envied and couldn't imagine for herself. The conversation was relentless, intellectual, often cruel in its wit. Everyone was expected to defend their ideas against sharp questioning. Sentimentality was scorned. Conventional morality was questioned. Sexual relationships were complicated, overlapping, discussed with a frankness that would have scandalised Victorian society. Vanessa had married Clive Bell in 1907, but by the 1920s their marriage was open, both having affairs while maintaining domestic partnership. Lytton Strachey was openly homosexual, in a time when that could still result in prosecution. The group's attitudes toward sexuality, toward marriage, toward social convention were decades ahead of mainstream British culture. Virginia's own marriage to Leonard remained stable but peculiar. They shared intellectual companionship, political interests, the work of running the Hogarth Press. But the sexual dimension was minimal or non-existent. Virginia later described herself as sexually frigid, though whether this was constitutional or the result of childhood trauma or simply lack of attraction to Leonard specifically is impossible to determine. They had what would now be called a companionate marriage, built on partnership rather than passion. It worked for them, or at least it survived, but it left Virginia vulnerable to other attachments that provided what the marriage couldn't. In 1922, she met Vita Sackville West at a dinner party. Vita was everything Virginia wasn't: aristocratic, confident, physically imposing at nearly 6 feet tall, openly bisexual, with a string of affairs behind her. She wrote novels and poetry, nothing as experimental as Virginia's work, but competent and popular. She was married to Harold Nicholson, a diplomat, and they had an arrangement similar to Vanessa and Clive's, both taking lovers while maintaining their partnership. The attraction was immediate and mutual. By 1925, they were lovers, though the affair developed slowly, tentatively on Virginia's part. Vita pursued her, wrote passionate letters, visited frequently. Virginia responded with her own letters, witty and flirtatious, but also uncertain, unused to being desired this way. The relationship gave her something Leonard couldn't: romantic intensity, physical affection, the experience of being wanted, not just for her mind, but for herself entire. Vita's family history fascinated Virginia. The Sackvilles had lived at Knowle, a vast estate in Kent, for centuries. Vita had grown up there, heir to all that history, but because she was female, the inheritance passed to her uncle instead. The injustice rankled. Vita loved Knowle with a passion that Virginia recognised as something beyond mere attachment to place. It was identity, continuity with the past, a kind of belonging Virginia had never experienced. This period, the mid-1920s, was the most productive of Virginia's life. She was writing Mrs. Dalloway, which would be published in May 1925. The novel takes place over a single day in June 1923, following Clarissa Dalloway as she prepares for a party that evening. But the book is also about Septimus Warren Smith, a shell-shocked war veteran who commits suicide that same day, though he and Clarissa never meet. The two narrative threads run parallel, linked thematically, if not literally, both exploring consciousness, memory, time, and the fragility of sanity. The technique refined what she'd started in Jacob's Room. The prose moves fluidly between characters, dipping into minds, following associations, leaping across time without clear transitions. Past and present interpenetrate. A sound or smell triggers memory, and suddenly we're in a character's childhood before returning to the present moment. The famous opening line, "Mrs. Dalloway said she would buy the flowers herself," launches into Clarissa's consciousness as she walks through London on a perfect June morning, and we don't leave that consciousness for long, even when the narrative shifts to other characters. Critics recognised it as a major achievement. Virginia had arrived at something like mastery of her experimental method. The reviews were strong, sales were respectable. She was becoming not just a novelist, but a significant figure in contemporary literature, someone whose work mattered, who was doing things no one else was doing. But the writing cost her. Each novel brought periods of intense headaches, insomnia, anxiety about whether the work was any good, fear that she was repeating herself or failing to achieve what she'd set out to do. Finishing a book often triggered depression, a crash after months of sustained intensity. Leonard watched her carefully during these periods, monitoring her health, trying to prevent the kind of total collapse she'd experienced in 1913 and 1915. The affair with Vita continued through these years, passionate at first, then gradually settling into deep friendship as the erotic intensity faded. Vita gave Virginia confidence in herself as someone desirable, not just as a mind but as a body, a person capable of inspiring passion. The relationship complicated her marriage, but didn't threaten it. Leonard accepted it, perhaps relieved that someone else could provide what he couldn't or wouldn't. In 1927, To the Lighthouse was published. This is the novel many consider her masterpiece, though arguments persist about whether it surpasses Mrs. Dalloway or The Waves. The book is structured in 3 parts. The first section, The Window, takes place over a single afternoon and evening at the Ramsay family's summer house in the Hebrides. The second section, Time Passes, covers 10 years in about 20 pages, describing the house falling into decay while the family is absent, and revealing in parenthetical asides that Mrs. Ramsay has died, that the eldest son Andrew was killed in the war, that the daughter Prue died in childbirth. The third section, The Lighthouse, shows the survivors returning to the house years later, finally making the trip to the lighthouse that was planned but never completed in the first section. The novel is about time, loss, art, and the impossibility of preserving what matters. Mrs. Ramsay, based partly on Virginia's mother Julia, is the heart of the first section, trying to hold her family together, creating moments of harmony that she knows can't last. Her death, in a parenthesis, almost a throwaway, is devastating precisely because it's so understated. The middle section shows time destroying what she built. The final section asks whether art, specifically the painting that Lily Briscoe completes, can preserve anything of what's been lost. Virginia wrote the book in a kind of trance, the prose flowing more easily than usual, as if she'd finally found the exact method her material required. The setting drew directly from those childhood summers in St Ives, Talland House, transformed into the Ramsays' summer home, Biography Lighthouse, visible across the bay. She was writing about her parents, her family, her childhood, but transformed through art into something that transcended autobiography. When she finished it, she felt she'd laid her mother's ghost to rest, exorcised something that had haunted her for 30 years. The book was published in May 1927, and the reviews were extraordinary, near universal recognition that she'd produced something remarkable. Sales were strong. The novel established her reputation definitively. She was now Virginia Woolf, major novelist, someone whose work would last. But even success brought anxiety. She worried about repeating herself, about whether she could do anything beyond what she'd already achieved. She was 45 years old. Most writers had done their best work by that age. What came next? Could she push further, find new methods, new subjects, or would she spend the rest of her career repeating variations on what she'd already accomplished? The answer came in 1928, when she was invited to give talks at 2 women's colleges at Cambridge, Newnham, and Girton. She'd been thinking about women and writing, about why there were so few women writers in history, about the material conditions that enabled or prevented artistic production. The talks became the basis for A Room of One's Own, published in 1929, one of the foundational texts of feminist literary criticism. The argument was deceptively simple. A woman must have money and a room of her own if she is to write fiction. But the essay unpacked that simplicity with devastating clarity, examining how poverty and lack of privacy had prevented women from writing, how the domestic duties imposed on women consumed the time and mental space that writing required, how the lack of education and the assumption that women's thoughts weren't worth recording had created a literary tradition almost entirely male. She invented a sister for Shakespeare, equally talented, and traced what would have happened to her in Elizabethan England. No education, no freedom to pursue her art, married off young, her gifts wasted or destroyed. The thought experiment made visible the structural barriers that had nothing to do with talent and everything to do with material conditions and social expectations. The book traced women's exclusion from education, from libraries, from the professions that gave men the economic independence to write. It examined how women had been defined by men, written about by men, studied by men, but almost never allowed to define themselves. The essay moved through history, literature, and contemporary life with a light touch that made devastating points seem almost casual. Why had there been no female Shakespeare? Not because women lacked genius, but because genius requires conditions that women had been systematically denied. The imaginary Shakespeare's sister would have been laughed at if she'd tried to join a theatre company, locked up if she'd persisted, possibly driven to suicide by the impossibility of her situation. The book sold well and sparked immediate debate. Some male critics dismissed it as propaganda. Women readers found it revelatory, articulating things they'd felt but couldn't name. The argument seems obvious now, but in 1929 it was radical to suggest that women's absence from literature wasn't natural but structural, not about capacity but about access to time, money, education, and freedom from domestic obligations. Virginia had written herself into a corner, though she didn't realise it yet. She'd produced 3 major novels in 5 years, plus the most influential feminist essay of the decade. The pressure to follow up was enormous, and she responded by doing something completely unexpected. Orlando appeared in 1928, and it was unlike anything she'd written before. Part biography, part fantasy, part love letter to Vita Sackville West. It told the story of a nobleman who lives for 4 centuries, changing sex halfway through from man to woman. The book was playful, experimental, witty in ways her other novels weren't. It mocked biography as a form, mocked literary convention, mocked the very idea that identity was fixed or stable. Orlando begins as a man in Elizabethan England, becomes a woman in the 18th century, and ends as a modern woman in 1928. The character experiencing history from both male and female perspectives, discovering that the differences matter less than you'd think. The novel was partly a celebration of Vita, whose aristocratic family home Noel provided the setting, whose ancestors inspired some of the historical episodes. Virginia gave Vita in fiction what she couldn't have in life: immortality and transformation. A character who transcended the limitations of a single lifetime or a single gender. The book was a bestseller, far more popular than anything Virginia had written before. It was accessible, entertaining, the kind of novel you could enjoy without wrestling with experimental technique. Some critics thought she'd sold out, abandoned her artistic principles for commercial success. Virginia knew better. She'd needed to write something light after the intensity of To the Lighthouse and the seriousness of A Room of One's Own. The playfulness was genuine, not calculated, a release of energy that had been building, but she couldn't stay in that lighter mode. The next project was The Waves, and it would be the most experimental thing she'd ever attempted, pushing stream of consciousness further than anyone had before, creating something so strange that it barely qualified as a novel at all. She began writing it in 1929, and it consumed her for 2 years. The book has almost no plot, no conventional narrative structure. 6 characters speak in stylized soliloquies throughout their lives, from childhood to old age, their voices weaving together and apart. Between each section, brief italicized passages describe the sun rising and setting over the sea, waves breaking on a beach. That's it. No dialogue in the traditional sense, no action, no description, except what the characters perceive and articulate in their interior monologues. The technical challenge was immense. Each character needed a distinct voice, a distinct way of experiencing the world, but the voices also needed to blend into a larger pattern, a collective consciousness that was more than the sum of its parts. Bernard is the storyteller, constantly turning life into narrative. Susan is rooted in nature, in the physical world of earth and growing things. Ginny is all sensation, living in her body, in the immediate moment. Neville is the intellectual, seeking order and beauty in art and literature. Rhoda is fragile, disconnected, barely able to maintain her hold on reality. Lewis is haunted by his colon, Isle origins, by class consciousness, by the desire to belong. And then there's Percival, who never speaks, who exists only in the others' perceptions of him, the absent centre around which they orbit. His death in India, sudden and meaningless, devastates them all. Virginia wrote the book in a kind of trance state, the language coming from somewhere she couldn't quite access consciously. The prose is unlike anything in her other novels. More poetic, more abstract, sentences that circle and repeat and transform. She was trying to capture something about the nature of consciousness itself, the way we experience time not as a sequence of events but as a continuous flow, moments bleeding into each other, past and present coexisting. The work was exhausting. She'd write for hours, then collapse, unable to do anything else. The book demanded everything she had, technically and emotionally. She was writing about friendship, about time, about death, about the impossibility of really knowing another person, about the loneliness of being trapped inside a single consciousness. When she finished it in 1931, she was convinced it was either her masterpiece or her failure, nothing in between. The reviews were mixed, which confirmed both her hopes and fears. Some critics praised it as her greatest achievement, a breakthrough in literary form. Others found it unreadable, pretentious, more poetry than novel. Sales were modest. The book was too difficult for most readers, too experimental even for those who'd admired Mrs. Dalloway and To the Lighthouse. But Virginia knew she'd done something that mattered, pushed as far as she could in that direction. The waves represented the extreme limit of her method, and she couldn't go further without abandoning narrative entirely. What came next would have to be different, a pulling back from that edge, a return to something more grounded in the social world, in politics and history. The 1930s brought new pressures. The political situation in Europe was deteriorating rapidly. Hitler had come to power in Germany. Fascism was spreading. War seemed increasingly inevitable. Virginia had always been political in her way, but her politics had focused on feminism, on women's rights, and economic independence. Now larger questions demanded attention. Could art matter when civilization itself was threatened? What was the writer's responsibility in a time of crisis? She began work on The Years, a novel that would trace a single family across 5 decades, from 1880 to the present day. It was meant to show how English society had changed, how the Victorian world her parents inhabited had given way to something different, how women's lives in particular had been transformed by economic and social forces. The novel would be realistic, traditional in structure, accessible to a wide audience. She wanted to reach beyond the small circle of experimental fiction readers to address the larger public about things that mattered. The writing was agonizing. Nothing came easily. She'd write a section, then rewrite it completely, then rewrite it again. The book kept expanding, becoming unwieldy, resistant to her intentions. She'd spent years on the waves and it had been difficult, but the difficulty had felt productive, like she was discovering new territory. This felt like failure, like she was trying to do something she'd already outgrown, forcing herself back into a mode that no longer fit. By 1935, she was close to a breakdown. The manuscript was enormous, over 200,000 words, and still it wasn't working. She couldn't see how to fix it, couldn't bear to abandon it. Leonard read it and told her gently that it needed major revision. She knew he was right, but the thought of cutting and reworking that massive text felt impossible. She fell into deep depression, the worst since the years after her marriage. The voices returned, the sensation that reality was becoming unstable, that she was losing her grip on the world. Leonard was terrified. He'd seen her like this before, knew how dangerous it could become. He managed her days carefully, limiting visitors, monitoring her work, making sure she ate and slept. She spent months in this state, barely functioning, terrified that she'd never recover, that this time the illness would win completely. She didn't kill herself, though the thought was there. She'd survived breakdowns before, knew somewhere that she could survive this one. By 1936, she'd pulled back from the edge, stabilised enough to work again. She cut the years brutally, removing whole sections, restructuring what remained. The book that emerged was much shorter than the original draft, more focused, though still different from her experimental novels. It was published in 1937, and to her surprise, it was a commercial success. Her best-selling novel yet. Critics were respectful, if not ecstatic. Readers bought it in large numbers, perhaps relieved to find a Virginia Woolf novel that didn't require the intense concentration of the waves, but the success felt hollow. She knew the book wasn't her best work, knew she'd compromised her vision to make it more accessible, and the compromise hadn't even been fully successful. The political questions remained. War was coming, clearly now, unavoidably. Hitler had annexed Austria, was threatening Czechoslovakia. Britain was rearming, preparing for conflict that seemed inevitable. In this context, what did literature matter? What did her concerns about narrative technique and consciousness have to do with the real crisis facing civilization? She began writing 3 Guineas, a long essay about war, fascism, and patriarchy. The argument was radical, connecting militarism to masculine power structures, suggesting that war was the inevitable result of the same systems that oppressed women. If you wanted to prevent war, you had to dismantle patriarchy, challenge the cult of masculinity that glorified violence and domination. The essay was more aggressive than a room of one's own, angrier, less concerned with making readers comfortable. It argued that women should refuse to support war efforts, refuse to participate in institutions that perpetuated male power, create alternative structures based on cooperation rather than competition. The book appeared in 1938 to hostile reviews. Male critics accused her of being naive, of not understanding the real threat of fascism, of putting feminist concerns above the survival of civilization. Even some of her friends thought she'd gone too far, made connections that didn't hold up. Virginia didn't care. She believed what she'd written, believed that the personal and the political were inseparable, that you couldn't fight fascism abroad while maintaining fascist structures at home. The outbreak of war in September 1939 proved her wrong in one sense, right in another. War had come despite everything, and Britain had no choice but to fight. But the systems she'd criticised remained intact, would remain intact after the war ended, assuming Britain survived. War transformed everything. London became dangerous in ways Virginia had never experienced. The Blitz began in September 1940, German bombers targeting the city night after night. The house at Mecklenburg Square, where the Woolfs kept their London base, was damaged in an air raid. Their old home at Tavistock Square was destroyed completely, blown apart, nothing left but rubble and memories. Monk's house in Rodmill became their permanent refuge. The Sussex countryside was safer, quieter, though German planes sometimes flew overhead on their way to bomb coastal targets. The war was everywhere, inescapable, reshaping daily life in ways large and small. Leonard was deeply involved in political work, writing about the war, about what a post-war world might look like, about the need for international cooperation to prevent future conflicts. Virginia supported his work, understood its importance, but felt increasingly disconnected from the immediate crisis. What could she contribute? Her novels explored consciousness and time, the inner lives of characters navigating ordinary days. What did that matter when civilization was tearing itself apart? When young men were dying in North Africa and France? When cities were being bombed into oblivion? She began a new novel anyway, Between the Acts, written during 1940, set in a single day in June 1939, the last summer of peace. The novel takes place at a country house where villagers are staging a pageant dramatising English history. The audience watches, comments, fails to fully understand what they're seeing. The structure mirrors her concerns. History as performance, civilization as fragile construct that could collapse at any moment. The characters know war is coming, but can't quite believe it, can't imagine the world they know ending. Virginia finished a draft in November 1940, but wasn't satisfied. The book felt slight compared to The Waves, less ambitious, less successful. She revised obsessively, changing scenes, cutting passages, unable to decide if the novel worked at all. The process was exhausting. She'd always found finishing a book draining, the period after completion dangerous for her mental state. This time was worse because the external circumstances were so dire. The war, the destruction of their London homes, the isolation of Rodmell, the sense that everything she'd valued was disappearing. She'd also completed a biography of Roger Fry, the art critic who'd been central to the Bloomsbury Group. He died in 1934, and his family asked Virginia to write his life. She'd agreed reluctantly, knowing biography wasn't her strength, knowing Roger deserved better than she could give him. The book appeared in July 1940 to respectful but unenthusiastic reviews. Critics acknowledged the careful research, the thorough documentation, but found the result curiously lifeless. Virginia knew they were right. She'd failed to capture Roger's vitality, his passion for art, the quality that made him magnetic. The failure stung. Not because she thought biography was important compared to fiction, but because she'd taken on the task and done it badly. Roger deserved better. His family deserved better. She'd let them down. By early 1941, she was struggling. The familiar symptoms were returning. Difficulty concentrating, inability to enjoy food, the sensation that reality was becoming unstable. Leonard watched her carefully, recognized the signs, tried to help. He suggested she rest more, work less. She agreed but couldn't actually stop. Her mind wouldn't quiet. She kept revising between the acts, kept questioning whether the novel should be published at all, whether it was good enough, whether it mattered. The voices began in March, not audible voices exactly, but a kind of internal noise, words that weren't hers crowding her thoughts. She'd experienced this before, during severe breakdowns. It was one of the most terrifying symptoms because it suggested she was losing control of her own mind. She couldn't concentrate enough to read. Books that normally absorbed her completely became incomprehensible after a few sentences. Writing was impossible. Even conversation became difficult because she couldn't follow what people were saying, couldn't formulate coherent responses. Leonard was frightened. He'd seen her this bad before, in 1913, after finishing The Voyage Out, when she'd attempted suicide and nearly succeeded. He knew how dangerous this state was, knew that rational arguments wouldn't help because she wasn't in a rational state. He tried anyway, reminded her that she'd recovered from previous breakdowns, that the illness always passed eventually, that she just needed to rest and wait. She agreed with him, said the right things, but he could see she didn't believe it. On March 18th, she wrote in her diary for the last time. The entry is fragmentary, difficult to follow, thoughts breaking off mid-sentence. She mentions the war, her inability to work, a sense of pressure building, then nothing. The next few days are documented through Leonard's recollections. Virginia seemed calmer, which initially relieved him. She was eating a bit better, sleeping more. He thought perhaps the worst had passed, that she was beginning to stabilize. She was planning, thinking through what came next, making decisions Leonard knew nothing about. On the morning of March 28th, she seemed normal. They had breakfast together, discussed ordinary things. She said she was going for a walk, as she often did. The weather was cold but dry. She put on her coat, took her walking stick. She walked to the River Ouse, which ran near Monk's house. The river was high from recent rains, flowing fast and cold. She picked up a large stone, put it in her coat pocket to weigh herself down. Then she walked into the water. Her body wasn't found for 3 weeks. Searchers looked for her immediately, after Leonard realised she was missing, but the river was deep and the current strong. On April 18th, children playing near the riverbank saw something caught in reeds. It was Virginia. She'd left 2 notes, one for Leonard, one for Vanessa. Both said essentially the same thing. She could feel the madness returning, couldn't face another breakdown, couldn't put them through it again. She thanked them for their love, apologised for what she was doing, said she was certain it was the right decision. The note to Leonard is the one that's remembered. "Dearest, I feel certain that I'm going mad again. I feel we can't go through another of those terrible times, and I shan't recover this time. I begin to hear voices and I can't concentrate, so I am doing what seems the best thing to do." She acknowledged everything he'd given her. "You have given me the greatest possible happiness. You have been in every way all that anyone could be. I don't think 2 people could have been happier till this terrible disease came." That final phrase is crucial. Till this terrible disease came. She didn't blame herself, didn't see the suicide as a moral failure. The illness was the enemy, had always been the enemy. She was simply ending a fight she knew she couldn't win this time. Leonard was devastated. He'd spent their entire marriage trying to protect her from herself, managing her days, monitoring her symptoms, doing everything possible to prevent exactly this. And he'd failed. The funeral was small, private. Her body was cremated, the ashes buried beneath an elm tree in the garden at Monk's house. No public ceremony, no memorial service. Just Leonard and Vanessa and a few close friends acknowledging the loss. The literary world responded slowly. War dominated the news, made a writer's suicide seem less significant than it would have in peacetime. But gradually, obituaries appeared, assessments of her work, recognition of what had been lost. Between the Acts was published in July 1941, 4 months after her death. Leonard had agonised over the decision. Virginia hadn't been satisfied with the manuscript, had kept revising, might not have wanted it published, but it was her final work, and Leonard believed it deserved to be read. Critics were respectful, recognising the novel's ambition even if they weren't entirely sure what to make of it. The book's meditation on history and performance, on civilization's fragility, seemed eerily appropriate given the war. Virginia had written about the end of one world just as another world was actually ending. What's her legacy? The question would have annoyed her. She hated thinking about reputation, about how she'd be remembered. But the answer matters because her influence extended far beyond her own time. The technical innovations first. Stream of consciousness as a method for representing thought wasn't entirely new, but Virginia refined it, made it precise and beautiful. Mrs. Dalloway and To the Lighthouse demonstrated how interior monologue could replace traditional plot, how following consciousness through time could reveal character more deeply than external action. Writers who came after learned from this. The idea that you could build an entire novel around a single day, that you could make consciousness itself the subject rather than just the medium, became possible because Virginia showed it could work. The feminist contribution is equally significant. A Room of One's Own remains essential reading. Its central argument that women need financial independence and personal space to create art is still relevant. The essay's method, moving between personal experience and historical analysis, created a template for feminist criticism. 3 Guineas was more controversial, but equally important. Its connection between patriarchy and militarism, its argument that war was the inevitable result of male power structures, influenced later feminist thinking about violence and gender. But beyond specific arguments, Virginia demonstrated through her life and work that women could be serious literary artists, not writers of domestic fiction or romance, but creators of formally innovative, intellectually demanding literature that changed how novels worked. She also showed the cost. The mental illness that shadowed her entire adult life, the breakdowns that interrupted her work, the constant vigilance required to stay functional, these were part of the story too. She didn't romanticize suffering, didn't pretend that creativity required madness. She simply lived with an illness that made everything harder while still producing work of extraordinary quality. The Bloomsbury Group's legacy is more complicated. The circle of artists and intellectuals Virginia belonged to influenced British culture profoundly, helped shape modernist aesthetics, challenged Victorian assumptions about art and morality. But Bloomsbury was also privileged, insulated from the concerns of ordinary people. The group's focus on aesthetic questions, on personal relationships, and artistic experimentation could seem irrelevant or even offensive to those struggling with poverty and injustice. Virginia was aware of this tension. Her work after the mid-1930s engaged increasingly with political questions, tried to connect personal experience to larger historical forces, but she never fully resolved the contradiction between her artistic commitments and the demands of political engagement. Her marriage to Leonard was central to everything she accomplished. He provided stability, managed practical matters, protected her from the worst effects of her illness. Without him, she might not have survived to write her major works. But the marriage also had costs: the lack of sexual intimacy, the careful management of her days, the constant awareness that Leonard was monitoring her for symptoms. These created a kind of confinement even as they enabled her work. She found emotional and physical intimacy elsewhere, primarily with Vita Sackville West. That relationship, passionate and sustaining, gave her something Leonard couldn't, but it was necessarily limited, bounded by both women's marriages, by social conventions, by the impossibility of living openly. The question of how to categorize her sexuality remains contentious. Was she lesbian, bisexual, something else entirely? The terms available in her time didn't capture the complexity of her desires and relationships. She loved Leonard deeply, but wasn't sexually attracted to him. She was passionately involved with Vita, but also with other women. The categories don't quite fit. What's clear is that she needed both kinds of relationship. Leonard for stability and intellectual companionship. Vita and others for passion and intimacy. The arrangement wasn't ideal, but it worked well enough to sustain her through most of her life. Her death at 59 cut short what might have been another productive period. She'd survived previous breakdowns, had always eventually recovered. There's no way to know if this time was truly different, if she was right that she wouldn't recover, or if the suicide was a terrible mistake made during a temporary crisis. What remains are the novels, 9 of them, each different, each exploring new territory. From the Voyage Out's relatively conventional narrative to the Wave's experimental structure, she kept pushing, kept trying to find new ways of representing consciousness and time. The essays remain vital too. A Room of One's Own, 3 Guineas, The Common Reader. These continue to be read not as historical artifacts, but as living arguments. The questions Virginia asked about women and writing, about war and patriarchy, about how we read and why it matters, these haven't been answered. They keep demanding responses. The diaries tell a different story than the public image. Virginia kept them from 1897 until just days before her death, thousands of pages documenting daily life, writing struggles, social encounters, political events. They weren't meant for publication. She wrote for herself, working through ideas, venting frustrations, recording conversations. Reading them now feels intrusive. These were private thoughts, never intended for strangers, but they reveal a Virginia more complex than the novels suggest, petty, jealous, snobbish sometimes, capable of cruelty in her assessments of friends and rivals, but also vulnerable, self-doubting, constantly questioning her own judgments. She worried obsessively about reviews. Each new book brought anxiety about critical reception, about sales, about whether the work justified the effort. The modernist writer, who seemed to transcend commercial concerns, was actually checking the Times literary supplement constantly, counting sales figures, comparing her success to contemporaries. The rivalry with Catherine Mansfield was particularly intense. Mansfield was a brilliant short story writer, also experimenting with consciousness and time. Virginia admired her work while resenting her talent. When Mansfield died of tuberculosis in 1923, Virginia's diary entry mixed genuine grief with relief that a competitor was gone. This ugliness matters, not because it diminishes her achievement, but because it makes her human. The diaries show someone struggling with all the petty emotions artists rarely admit to: envy, insecurity, the desperate need for validation. They also show her working method. She'd draft quickly, pouring out pages without stopping to revise. Then she'd go back, cutting, tightening, searching for the exact rhythm. The published novels seem effortless, but the diaries reveal how much labour went into achieving that effect. Her reading was voracious and eclectic. Greek classics, contemporary novels, history, biography, poetry. She read constantly, thinking through problems in her own work by engaging with others. The essays in The Common Reader grew directly from this practice, arguing that ordinary readers, not just scholars, could engage seriously with literature. The relationship between her criticism and her fiction was intimate. Writing about other authors helped her understand what she was trying to do. The essay, Modern Fiction, laid out her aesthetic principles, her rejection of materialist realism, her commitment to capturing consciousness directly. She argued that life isn't a series of external events but a luminous halo, a semi-transparent envelope surrounding consciousness. Fiction should capture that envelope, not just record what happens. The novelist's job was to convey the pattern of thoughts and sensations, the way experience actually feels. This sounds abstract until you read Mrs. Dalloway. Clarissa preparing for her party, buying flowers, encountering old friends. The day's events matter less than the thoughts they trigger. Past and present blend. Memory intrudes constantly. The boundary between self and world keeps dissolving. Septimus Warren Smith, shell-shocked veteran, experiences this dissolution as madness. His consciousness has been shattered by war. He hears birds speaking Greek, sees his dead friend Evans, can't distinguish between inside and outside. The novel links his psychosis to Clarissa's more controlled flow of consciousness, suggesting they're points on a continuum rather than separate states. Virginia understood madness from the inside. The voices Septimus hears, the inability to concentrate, the sense that meaning has collapsed, these came from her own breakdowns. Writing them into fiction was both exploration and exorcism. To the Lighthouse pushed the technique further. The middle section, Time Passes, covers 10 years in about 20 pages. Mrs. Ramsay dies, the house decays, war happens, but these events appear in brackets, parenthetical to the real subject, which is time itself, eroding everything. The novel's structure mirrors consciousness. Part 1 stretches an afternoon into over 100 pages. Part 2 compresses a decade into a few. Part 3 returns to expanded time, another afternoon. This isn't arbitrary. It's how memory actually works, dwelling on certain moments while skipping years. Lily Briscoe, trying to paint Mrs. Ramsay, struggles with the same problem Virginia faced writing. How do you capture essence when everything keeps shifting? How do you make something permanent when consciousness is nothing but flow? The answer isn't resolution, but acceptance. Lily finishes her painting not by solving the problem, but by accepting its impossibility. She has her vision, draws a line in the centre, and the painting exists in that moment, even though it will fade and be forgotten. The waves went furthest into pure consciousness. 6 characters speak in soliloquies from childhood to old age. There's minimal plot, almost no external action. Everything happens in their minds. Their attempts to articulate experience through language that constantly fails them. Bernard, the would-be novelist, keeps trying to tell stories that will make sense of life, but the stories never quite work. They simplify, falsify, impose pattern where there's only flux. By the end, he gives up the attempt, accepts that he can't sum anything up. The novel is difficult. Many readers find it impossible. There's no story to follow, no characters to identify with in the conventional sense. You're asked to experience consciousness directly, without the usual fictional scaffolding. Virginia knew this limited her audience. The Waves sold poorly compared to her earlier work. Critics were divided. Some called it a masterpiece. Others dismissed it as unreadable self-indulgence. She'd pushed her method to its limit and found the limit was real. After The Waves, she pulled back slightly. The years returned to a more conventional structure, following a family through several decades, using chapters dated with specific years. But even here, consciousness remains the real subject. External events matter only as they're filtered through individual minds. Between the acts, her final novel blends the experimental and the accessible. Set on a single day at a country house, it weaves together a pageant depicting English history with the private thoughts of characters watching. Past and present overlap. Art and life interpenetrate. The novel feels like a summing up, not just of her career, but of England itself, on the brink of war, uncertain whether civilization will survive. The pageant performers are amateurs, the production chaotic, but something essential gets communicated anyway. She was revising it when war came. London was being bombed. Their house at Mecklenburgh Square was destroyed. Monk's house in Sussex became their primary residence, but even there, German planes flew overhead constantly. The war made everything she'd spent her life doing seem irrelevant. What did experimental fiction matter when civilization was collapsing? What use were novels about consciousness when people were dying in bombing raids? These questions plagued her final months. The depression that had always threatened was closing in. Leonard saw it happening. He recognized the signs from previous breakdowns. He tried to get her to rest, to stop working, to see doctors. But this time, she couldn't pull back from the edge. Her final diary entries are fragmentary. She couldn't concentrate. The voices she'd written about in Mrs. Dalloway, the ones Septimus heard, were becoming real for her. She knew what was happening and knew she couldn't stop it. The suicide note to Leonard is heartbreaking in its clarity. She wasn't confused about what she was doing. She believed she was going mad again and wouldn't recover. Whether she was right, whether given time she might have come through as she had before, that's unknowable. What's certain is that she was exhausted. 59 years of fighting her illness, of managing symptoms, of the constant vigilance required to stay functional. She'd lived with this since 13. Maybe she just couldn't do it anymore. Her death devastated Leonard. They'd been married 29 years. Despite the lack of physical intimacy, despite the complications, the marriage had worked. They'd built a life together, created the Hogarth Press, supported each other's work. Vanessa was destroyed too. The sisters had been each other's anchors since childhood. They'd survived their mother's death, their father's, Thoby's. They'd created new lives, new identities. Losing Virginia left Vanessa unmoored. The literary world mourned but also moved on. War was happening. People were dying. One writer's suicide, however tragic, couldn't command sustained attention. It took years for her reputation to solidify. In the immediate post-war period, her work seemed dated, too focused on consciousness and aesthetics when the world demanded engagement with politics and history. The angry young men of the 1950s dismissed Bloomsbury as effete and irrelevant, but feminism's second wave rediscovered her. A Room of One's Own became a founding text, its arguments about women's exclusion from literary history suddenly urgent again. The novels were reread not as aesthetic experiments, but as explorations of female consciousness under patriarchy. This reading emphasised different aspects. Mrs. Dalloway became about a woman trapped in a social role, her party a performance of femininity she can't escape. To the Lighthouse showed Mrs. Ramsay destroyed by domesticity, her creativity channeled into managing other people's emotions. Some of this was there in the text. Virginia was always aware of gender's constraints, wrote about them directly in her essays, but she'd also resisted being categorized as a woman writer, insisted she was simply a writer, that gender shouldn't determine how work was read. The tension between these positions has never resolved. Is she a feminist writer or a writer who happens to be female? Both readings find support. Her work explores female experience while also transcending it, creating a universal vision of consciousness that isn't gender-specific. Recent scholarship has explored her sexuality more directly. The relationship with Vita, once treated as minor biographical detail, is now understood as central. Orlando, the novel it inspired, is read as queer literature, celebrating gender fluidity and same-sex desire. This opens up new readings of earlier work. The passionate female friendships in her novels, previously seen as conventional, now appear more charged. The ambiguity around desire and identity takes on different meanings when you know the author's own ambivalence about sexual categories. But there's danger in overcorrecting. Making Virginia primarily a queer icon risks reducing her to identity categories she wouldn't have recognised. She loved women, yes, but also loved Leonard in her way. The complexity matters more than any single label. What endures is the writing itself. The novels continue finding readers who respond to their particular vision. Not everyone does. Virginia's work demands patience, requires active engagement. You can't read passively and expect conventional satisfactions, but for those who connect, the experience is profound. Her sentences capture something about consciousness that remains true. The way thoughts interrupt each other, the way past and present blur, the way meaning constantly threatens to dissolve, but somehow coheres anyway. She showed that fiction could do things it hadn't done before, could move inside consciousness and stay there, could make time elastic, could dissolve the boundary between observer and observed. These techniques have been absorbed by countless writers since, become part of how modern fiction operates. The essays remain vital because the questions persist. How should we read? What is the relationship between art and politics? Can women write freely when economic and social constraints limit their freedom? These aren't historical questions. They're still being argued. Her diaries reveal someone different from the canonical author. The published version of her life smooths contradictions, makes her coherent. But the diaries catch her in real time, unedited. One day, she's euphoric about a sentence she wrote. The next, she's convinced everything is garbage. She obsesses over reviews, tracks sales, compares herself to contemporaries. She worries about money despite relative security. She notes every slight, real or imagined, from friends and editors. The private Virginia was pettier than admirers want to admit. She could be cruel about other writers, dismissive of work she saw as inferior. She mocked Joyce's Ulysses as pretentious and unreadable, though later admitted she'd been wrong. She was jealous of Catherine Mansfield's success, called her stories slight, then mourned genuinely when Mansfield died young. The contradictions don't diminish her, they make her human. Leonard emerges from the diaries as more complex than the devoted husband narrative suggests. Yes, he protected her, managed her illness, ran the press, but he also controlled her. Decided when she could work, when she needed rest, what stimulation was safe. His motives were loving, but the dynamic was paternalistic. Virginia chafed against it, resented being managed like a child, but also depended on the structure he provided. The marriage worked because both needed what the other offered, even when they resented it. The question of children haunts the margins. Doctors advised against it. Leonard agreed. Virginia claimed not to mind, said she was too selfish for motherhood, that her work was her child. But the diaries show ambivalence. She envied Vanessa's children, felt incomplete watching her sister's domestic life. The choice was made for her by illness and Leonard's caution. Whether she truly accepted it or buried the grief remains unclear. Monk's House, their country retreat, became central to her last years. She'd written about needing a room of one's own. At Monk's House, she had a writing lodge, a small building separate from the main house where she could work undisturbed. The space was simple: a desk, a chair, a view of the Sussex Downs. She wrote between the acts there her final novel, completed months before her death. Between the Acts is strange. It's set over one day at a country house, where the villagers are staging a historical pageant. The pageant covers English history from medieval times to the present, performed by amateurs who keep forgetting their lines. The audience watches, argues about the meaning, gets distracted by personal dramas. The novel moves between inner thoughts and external action, between past and present, between performance and reality. Critics have struggled with it. Is it about England on the brink of war? About the continuity of history? About art's relationship to life? All of these, probably. Virginia was writing while bombs fell on London, while Europe collapsed into violence. The pageant's fragmented structure mirrors that fragmentation. The past doesn't offer wisdom or comfort. It just repeats. She finished the manuscript in November 1940. Leonard read it, suggested minor revisions. She was exhausted, depressed, uncertain about the book's quality. The pattern was familiar. Completing a novel always brought breakdown risk, but this time was different. The exhaustion didn't lift. The depression deepened. Her London homes had been bombed. She and Leonard stayed at Monk's House full-time, something they'd never done before. The isolation pressed on her. No distractions, no parties, no gallery openings. Just the village and the war news and her own thoughts circling. The voices began returning. Auditory hallucinations she'd experienced during previous breakdowns. Birds speaking Greek. Dead people calling her name. She recognized the signs, knew what was coming, feared it more than anything. The breakdowns had been getting worse. Each recovery was harder. She didn't believe she could survive another one. Leonard noticed. He always noticed. He tried to manage it, monitor her, keep her stable, but she'd made her decision. On March 18th, she wrote 2 suicide notes, one to Leonard, one to Vanessa. She hid them, waited for the right moment. March 28th, 1941. A cold Friday morning. She told Leonard she was going for a walk. Normal. She often walked in the morning. She put on her coat, took her walking stick, left the house. She walked to the River Ouse a mile away. The river was high, running fast with spring rain. She filled her coat pockets with stones, large ones, heavy enough to keep her down. Then she walked into the water. Her body wasn't found for 3 weeks. Decomposed, caught in reeds downstream. Leonard identified her by her clothes. He took her remains back to Monk's House, cremated them, buried the ashes beneath an elm tree in the garden. The tree is still there. Visitors leave stones on the spot. The suicide note to Leonard is famous now. Dearest, I feel certain that I'm going mad again. I feel we can't go through another of those terrible times, and I shan't recover this time. I begin to hear voices, and I can't concentrate. So I am doing what seems the best thing to do. She thanked him, said he'd given her the greatest happiness possible, that no 2 people could have been happier until the disease came. The tone is calm, decided, almost businesslike. She'd thought it through. This wasn't impulse. The note to Vanessa was shorter. She asked her sister to help Leonard through what was coming, said she couldn't go on. The relationship between the sisters had always been complicated. Vanessa was stable, where Virginia was volatile. practical, where Virginia was theoretical. They loved each other, but couldn't quite understand each other. Vanessa survived her by 20 years, painting until the end, never speaking publicly about her sister's death. Leonard lived until 1969. He never remarried. He edited Virginia's diaries for publication, wrote his own memoirs, managed her literary estate. He presented their marriage as devoted partnership, himself as protective husband. The truth was more complicated, but his version stuck. He'd earned the right to tell the story his way. The war Virginia feared she wouldn't survive ended 4 years after her death. England survived, changed. The world she'd known, the one she'd written about in her novels, was already gone by 1941. The class system that had supported people like the Woolfs was collapsing. The country houses were being sold off or demolished. The servants were working in factories. Everything was being levelled. Her work outlasted the world that produced it. That's the strange thing about literature. It's tied to specific times and places, but survives their disappearance. You don't need to know anything about Edwardian England to read Mrs. Dalloway. The social context enriches it, but the consciousness at its centre is portable, transferable, still recognisable. Modern readers encounter her work through different doorways. Some come through feminism, through A Room of One's Own and its arguments about women's economic independence and creative freedom. Some come through modernism, through the formal experiments and innovations. Some come through biography, fascinated by her illness, her suicide, her relationship with Vita. Each entry point opens different aspects of the work. The feminist reading has been most influential. A Room of One's Own is taught in women's studies courses, quoted in arguments about gender inequality, cited in debates about representation and power. Its central insight, that material conditions enable creativity, that you can't write without money and space and time, remains urgent. Virginia was arguing against the myth of natural genius, the idea that talent emerges regardless of circumstances. She was saying opportunity matters, access matters, who gets to speak matters. But she was also saying something more radical, that women's exclusion from literature had impoverished literature itself, that different perspectives create different forms, that what women might write, if given the chance, could transform what writing is. This wasn't just about fairness, it was about expanding possibility. Her own work proved the point. The novels she wrote were different from what men were writing. Not better or worse, different. They valued different things, structured time differently, paid attention to aspects of experience male writers ignored. The domestic sphere wasn't background. It was where life happened, where consciousness formed, where meaning was made or failed to be made. Mrs. Ramsay's dinner party into the Lighthouse is as significant as any battlefield scene in a war novel. The emotional labour of bringing people together, managing their moods, creating temporary harmony, this is work. It requires intelligence and skill. Virginia made it visible, showed its complexity and cost. The modernist reading emphasises technique, stream of consciousness, interior monologue, temporal experimentation. These were revolutionary. Joyce and Proust were doing similar things, but Virginia's version was distinct. She was less interested in psychological realism than in capturing the texture of awareness itself. The way consciousness moves, the way it's simultaneously focused and diffuse, present and absent, connected and isolated. The waves represents the extreme of this approach. 6 voices, 6 perspectives, moving through life from childhood to old age. They speak in stylized monologues that aren't quite realistic dialogue, aren't quite internal thought. The prose is poetic, rhythmic, deliberately artificial. Critics still argue whether it works. Some find it beautiful, others find it precious, detached from actual human experience. What's undeniable is its ambition. Virginia was trying to write consciousness without the constraints of character or plot, To create a novel that was pure subjectivity, pure flow, whether she succeeded depends on what you value in fiction. If you want narrative drive and emotional engagement, The Waves frustrates. If you want linguistic beauty and philosophical meditation, it delivers. The biographical reading focuses on the life, the illness, the drama. This risks reducing her to a case study, a victim, a tragedy. But it's also true that you can't separate the work from the mental illness that shaped it. The breakdowns interrupted her writing, forced long periods of silence and recovery, but they also gave her access to states of consciousness most people don't experience. The dissolution of self, the loss of boundaries between inner and outer, the sense of time becoming liquid. She used this material, the hallucinations, the voices, the terror of losing her mind. These appear in the novels transformed into technique. Septimus in Mrs. Dalloway is clearly based on her own experiences of psychosis. His visions, his inability to filter sensory input, his conviction that he's receiving messages, this is drawn from life. But it's also critique. Septimus is a shell-shocked soldier, destroyed by war and by doctors who don't understand trauma. His suicide is both personal tragedy and political statement. The relationship with Vita remains endlessly fascinating. The letters between them, published decades after both died, reveal passion that contemporaries either didn't notice or politely ignored. Virginia's letters are flirtatious, adoring, sometimes explicitly sexual. Vita's are more guarded, but clearly reciprocal. They were lovers, definitely, though the exact nature of the physical relationship remains debated. Orlando is the public monument to the affair, a novel about someone who lives for centuries, changing from man to woman somewhere in the middle, experiencing history and love and identity as fluid rather than fixed. It's playful, fantastical, completely unlike Virginia's other novels. She was having fun, writing a love letter disguised as fiction, creating a character who was obviously Vita, but also something more. The novel was commercially successful, her bestseller during her lifetime. Critics were confused. It didn't fit the serious modernist image. It seemed light, frivolous, but that misses the point. Virginia was exploring gender and identity and performance decades before those became academic subjects. Orlando is queer literature before the category existed, celebrating fluidity and possibility. Vita eventually moved on. She returned to her husband, Harold Nicholson, with whom she had an open marriage. She and Virginia remained friends, but the intensity faded. Virginia minded less than you'd expect. The relationship had served its purpose, given her what she needed when she needed it. She wasn't possessive about people or experiences. She used them, transformed them into art, let them go. That sounds cold, but it's just how writers work. Everything becomes material. Every relationship, every conversation, every moment of joy or pain. You can't write honestly without mining your own life. Virginia understood this, accepted it as the cost of the work she wanted to do. Her last decade was productive despite everything. The Years appeared in 1937, a more conventional novel than what came before, following a family through 50 years. 3 Guineas, her most explicitly political essay, appeared in 1938, arguing against war and patriarchy as interconnected systems of violence. Between the Acts came posthumously in 1941. She was also working on a memoir, a sketch of the past during her final years. It was never finished. The fragments that survive are extraordinary. She writes about her childhood, her parents, the sexual abuse by her half-brothers. The tone is analytical, trying to understand how experience becomes memory, how memory shapes identity. She's examining her own consciousness, the way she examined her characters. The memoir makes clear that she knew the abuse had damaged her. She traces her fear of physical intimacy, her discomfort in her own body, back to those early violations. She's not making excuses, just trying to understand causation. How does trauma work? How does it persist across decades? How does it shape what you can create? The questions she was asking weren't abstract, they were urgent. She needed to understand her own mind because she couldn't trust it. The breakdowns had taught her that consciousness could fracture, that reality could become unreliable. Writing was how she investigated that instability, how she mapped the territory of her own experience. By 1940, the world was collapsing. War had come again. Leonard and Virginia were living primarily at Monk's house in Rodmell, their country home in Sussex. London was being bombed. Their flat at Mecklenburgh Square was destroyed in September. Their Tavistock Square house had been hit earlier. The physical spaces where she'd created her best work were gone, reduced to rubble by German bombs. She kept writing. Between the Acts was finished in November 1940. It's her strangest novel, set during a single day in June 1939, just before war begins. A village pageant performs scenes from English history, while characters watch and think and worry about the coming conflict. The novel is fragmented, uncertain, the narrative constantly interrupted by the pageant, by characters' thoughts, by the narrator's intrusions. It feels like a mind trying to hold itself together while everything around it falls apart. The biography of Roger Fry had been published in July 1940. She'd spent years on it, trying to capture the man who'd been so important to Bloomsbury, the art critic who'd introduced post-impressionism to England. The reviews were respectful, but not enthusiastic. She felt she'd failed, that she hadn't captured him properly, that biography as a form was too limited for what she wanted to say about a person. Everything was wearing on her. The war, the bombings, the constant anxiety. Leonard was working with local defence preparations. Food was rationed. The future was unknowable. And she was finishing another book, which always brought exhaustion and doubt. The headaches were returning. The voices were starting again. She recognised the signs. She'd been through this before, multiple times. The pattern was familiar. First the exhaustion, then the inability to concentrate, then the voices, the sense that people were talking about her, that radio broadcasts contained messages meant for her specifically. Then the spiral into psychosis. She knew what was coming. She'd survived it before, but each time was worse. Each time took longer to recover from. Each time required more care, more medical intervention, more disruption to Leonard's life and work. She was 59 years old. She'd been fighting this for 46 years, since her mother's death when she was 13. On March 28, 1941, she wrote 2 letters, one to Leonard, one to Vanessa. The letter to Leonard is heartbreaking. She tells him she's certain she's going mad again, that she can't face another breakdown, that she won't recover this time. She thanks him for the happiness he's given her, tells him he's been everything anyone could be, that 2 people couldn't have been happier until this terrible disease came. She's not angry or dramatic. She's explaining a decision, providing reasoning. She loves him. She doesn't want to burden him anymore. This is the only solution she can see. The letter to Vanessa is shorter. She tells her sister she can't go on, that she's spoiling Leonard's life, that she can't write, that everything she's tried to say has failed. After writing the letters, she walked to the River Ouse. She put a large stone in her pocket, walked into the water, and drowned. Her body wasn't found for 3 weeks, discovered on April 18th downstream from where she'd entered. Leonard buried her ashes under an elm tree in the garden at Monk's house. He lived there for another 28 years, never remarrying, continuing to work, to publish, to be involved in politics and literature. He kept her memory alive, but didn't make a shrine of it. The response to her death was immediate and complicated. Obituaries praised her literary achievements, while often getting the work wrong, emphasising the wrong books, misunderstanding her innovations. Some focused on her mental illness, as if that were the main story, as if the work was secondary to the breakdown. But the work survived. Between the Acts was published posthumously in 1941. The essay collections, the diaries, the letters began appearing in later years. Scholars started seriously examining what she'd accomplished, how she'd changed the novel, what her feminist writings meant. The diaries are extraordinary. Leonard edited and published selections starting in the 1950s. Reading them, you get Virginia unfiltered. Her jealousies, her insecurities, her ambitions, her friendships, her daily struggles with writing. She's funny, petty, brilliant, cruel, generous, all mixed together. She's human in ways the novels sometimes obscure. The letters show similar complexity. She could be charming and cutting in the same sentence. She gossiped viciously about people she claimed to love. She was competitive with other writers, especially women, while also championing their work. She contained multitudes. Her influence on literature is impossible to measure because it's everywhere. The stream of consciousness technique she perfected became standard. The idea that fiction could explore interior life as thoroughly as external action became accepted. The notion that women's experiences were worth serious literary treatment became obvious, though it wasn't obvious before she made it so. A Room of One's Own remains the foundational text of feminist literary criticism. Every argument about women's exclusion from literary history, about the material conditions required for artistic creation, about how gender shapes what stories get told and how they get received, starts with that essay. She identified the problems and provided the analytical tools for understanding them. The novels continue to be read, taught, adapted. Mrs. Dalloway appears on every modernist's syllabus. To the Lighthouse is considered one of the greatest novels of the 20th century. The Waves challenges every reader who encounters it. Orlando has been reclaimed by queer scholars as pioneering work on gender fluidity and performance. She's become canonical, which means she's been absorbed into the establishment she spent her life resisting. Universities teach her in required courses. Her face appears on currency and stamps. Tourist sites mark places she lived. This is what happens to revolutionaries who succeed. They become institutions. But reading the work, you can still feel the rebellion, the refusal to write conventional plots, the insistence that women's interior lives matter as much as men's public achievements, the exploration of consciousness as fluid, unstable, constantly shifting, the formal innovations that make reading an active experience rather than passive consumption. She wasn't trying to be difficult, she was trying to capture truth. Reality, as she experienced it, wasn't linear or stable. Consciousness didn't move in straight lines. Memory and perception and thought all intermingled. Writing that pretended otherwise was lying, simplifying human experience to make it easier to consume. Her contemporaries understood this better than later readers sometimes do. Other modernists, Joyce and Woolf and Faulkner, were all attempting similar things. They were trying to find forms adequate to modern consciousness, to the experience of living in a world that was changing faster than anyone could process. World War I had shattered certainty. The old forms, the Victorian novels with their omniscient narrators and clear moral frameworks, couldn't contain what people had experienced. New forms were necessary. Virginia provided some of those forms. The cost was high. The work required everything. The mental illness made everything harder. She had periods of productivity and periods where she couldn't work at all. She had stretches of relative stability and episodes of complete breakdown. The writing was both necessity and burden. Leonard protected her as much as anyone could. He managed their lives, handled practical matters, monitored her health, tried to create conditions where she could work. He wasn't perfect, his control could be stifling, but he kept her alive for decades longer than she might have survived alone. The Bloomsbury Group provided community and intellectual stimulation, but also competition and drama. They were brilliant, ambitious people who spent decades in close proximity. They supported each other and undermined each other. They had affairs, fell out, reconciled, gossiped constantly. Virginia was at the centre, both participating in and observing the dynamics. Her friendships with women were particularly important. Vanessa remained her closest connection, the person who understood her childhood, her family, her history. Their relationship had tensions but never broke. Vita provided passion and escape. Other women writers, Catherine Mansfield before she died, Ethel Smith in later years, offered different forms of connection and recognition. She needed to be seen, not just as a writer but as a person. The work was how she processed experience, but the relationships were what made life bearable. She couldn't have survived without both. The legacy is complicated. She's claimed by feminists, by queer scholars, by modernist critics, by theorists of various types. Each group emphasizes different aspects of the work. All of them find something genuine. She was writing about gender, sexuality, consciousness, class, war, art, death, all of it intertwined. She never separated politics from aesthetics. The form of her novels was political. The content was political. The decision to write about women's experiences was political. The experimental techniques were challenges to conventional authority, literary and social. A Room of One's Own argues that women need money and space to create, but it's also arguing that the entire structure of literary history needs rethinking, that the canon reflects power rather than merit, that women's exclusion wasn't natural or inevitable, but enforced, that changing material conditions would change what literature looked like. Three Guineas takes this further, connecting patriarchy and militarism, arguing that the same structures that oppress women create war. It's her most explicit political statement, written as Europe moved toward another catastrophe. She traces the connections between domestic tyranny and international violence, between the private and public spheres. The war came anyway. All the arguments and analysis couldn't stop it. She watched young men go to fight again, watched cities burn, watched civilization collapse into barbarism one more time. The horror of it, the futility, the sense that nothing learned from the last war had prevented this one, all of it pressed on her. The decision to die wasn't sudden. It was considered, rational in its way. She knew what was coming, knew she couldn't face it again, knew Leonard would suffer through another breakdown with her if she didn't stop it. The letters make this clear. She was protecting him as much as ending her own suffering. The tragedy isn't that she died. Everyone dies. The tragedy is that she felt she had to die then, at 59, with possibly years of creative work remaining. The tragedy is the illness that made life unbearable, the lack of effective treatment, the cumulative weight of decades of suffering. But she left the work. 9 novels, multiple essay collections, short stories, criticism, reviews, diaries, letters. It's an extraordinary body of work created under extraordinary difficulties. Every word was earned through struggle. Reading her now, 80 years after her death, the voice remains immediate. The sentences pull you into the consciousness she's creating. The questions she asked about how to capture interior life, how to represent time and memory, how to write honestly about experience. These questions remain relevant. Every writer working in her wake is responding to what she discovered, what she made possible. She changed what fiction could do. She expanded the territory available to novelists. She made it acceptable, even necessary, to write about consciousness itself, not just external events. She demonstrated that women's experiences were worthy of serious literary treatment. She created forms that continue to influence how stories get told. That's the legacy that matters. Not the mythology, not the tragedy, not the illness, but the work. The sentences that continue to live, the techniques that open new possibilities, the vision of what literature could achieve. She gave everything to that work, and the work endures. She's everywhere now and nowhere. Her face on British currency, her name on university buildings, her books assigned in classrooms worldwide. The woman who struggled to get published, who printed her own work on a hand press in her dining room, has become an institution. This is what happens to revolutionaries who win. They get absorbed into the system they fought against. But read the work, and you still feel the rebellion, the refusal to write neat plots, the insistence that consciousness matters more than events, the formal experiments that make reading active rather than passive. She wasn't being difficult for the sake of it. She was trying to capture truth as she experienced it, and reality, as she experienced it, wasn't linear or stable. Her influence runs deeper than most people realize. Writers who've never read her work are still working in territory she mapped. The idea that novels can move inside consciousness and stay there, that time can be elastic, that boundaries between past and present can dissolve, all of this became possible because she showed it could work. The feminist legacy is more visible, but also more contested. A room of one's own remains essential, its central argument about material conditions and creative freedom still urgent. But younger feminists sometimes find her work too focused on white upper-class women, too embedded in privilege to speak to broader struggles. Fair criticism, probably. She wrote from where she stood, which was a position of considerable advantage despite the constraints of gender and mental illness. The queer reading has opened new dimensions. Orlando isn't just a playful fantasy anymore. It's a foundational text for thinking about gender fluidity, about desire that refuses categorization, about identity as performance rather than essence. She was writing this in 1928, decades before the terminology existed to discuss it properly. Modern readers encounter problems she couldn't have anticipated. The class assumptions embedded in her work, the casual anti-Semitism that appears occasionally, the colonial attitudes that went unquestioned in her circles. These things are there, they're real. They complicate how we read her now. You can acknowledge them without dismissing everything else. The mental illness question refuses to settle. Was she a genius despite her breakdowns? Or because of them? The question itself is probably wrong. The illness gave her access to extreme states of consciousness. Yes, but it also nearly killed her multiple times and eventually succeeded. You can't separate the work from the suffering that produced it, but you also can't romanticize that suffering as somehow necessary for creation. She would have hated being reduced to a case study. The work mattered to her more than anything, more than relationships, more than happiness, certainly more than her own life. She gave everything to it, and when she couldn't work anymore, when the voices returned and concentration became impossible, she ended it. Not because she was weak, but because she knew what mattered and knew she couldn't do it anymore. Leonard lived another 28 years. He kept the house at Rodmell, kept her papers, began the careful work of editing and publishing her diaries and letters. He could have shaped the narrative any way he wanted, presented himself as hero or victim, emphasized or downplayed aspects of their relationship. Mostly he just tried to tell the truth, as he understood it, which was all anyone could ask. Vanessa outlived her by 20 years, painting until near the end, never speaking publicly about Virginia's death. The sisters had been tangled together since childhood, survivors of the same traumas, navigators of the same complicated family dynamics. Losing Virginia left Vanessa with no one who remembered everything, no one who shared the full history. The Bloomsbury Group scattered and aged. Some members lived into the 1960s and 70s, long enough to see their youthful rebellion become historical artifact. Their experimental aesthetics become mainstream. They changed British culture in ways that became invisible because they became normal. That's success, though it probably didn't feel like it. The work keeps generating new readings, new controversies, new applications. Scholars publish books arguing about technical details of her prose, about the politics of her representations, about her sexuality, her class position, her aesthetic principles. The arguments will continue because the work is rich enough to support multiple interpretations, contradictory enough to resist final judgments. She's taught in high schools now, which would have amused and appalled her. Students who don't know anything about modernism or stream of consciousness or the Bloomsbury Group encounter Mrs. Dalloway or To the Lighthouse and have to figure out what's happening, why the narrative keeps shifting, why there's no clear plot. Some hate it, some are transformed by it. Both reactions make sense. The sentences still work. That's what matters most. The prose that seemed so experimental, so difficult, so deliberately obscure to early readers now feels natural, right? Like the only way to capture what she was trying to capture. The innovations have been absorbed so thoroughly that they've become invisible, which is how you know they succeeded. You can still visit Monk's house in Rodmill. The National Trust maintains it, keeps it as it was when she lived there. The writing lodge where she worked is still there, separate from the main house, the space she needed to think and write. The garden where Leonard buried her ashes has changed, grown wild and been replanted, but the elm tree stood for decades until disease killed it. A new tree marks the spot now. People leave stones on her grave, small offerings from strangers who feel connected to her work, to her struggle, to her vision. They come from everywhere, readers who found something in her words that spoke to them across the decades, across the vast distances of language and culture and experience. She wrote to be understood, not to be worshipped. The canonization would embarrass her. She wanted readers, not disciples. She wanted engagement with ideas, not reverence for her person. The work was what mattered, always the work. The attempt to capture something true about consciousness and time and experience. The method she developed, the stream of consciousness technique that became her signature, wasn't a trick or a gimmick. It was a response to a genuine problem. How do you represent thought? How do you capture the way minds actually work? The way they drift and associate and remember and perceive? Traditional narrative couldn't do it because traditional narrative imposed false order on experience. She was trying to write truthfully about what it felt like to be alive, to be conscious, to be trapped inside a single perspective, while knowing that other perspectives existed and mattered. The difficulty of her prose wasn't affectation. It was the necessary cost of attempting something that hadn't been done before. The feminist argument wasn't separate from the aesthetic argument. The form of her novels was political. Writing about women's interior lives required new forms, because the old forms had been designed to tell men's stories. You couldn't just insert female characters into traditional narratives and expect it to work. You had to reimagine what narrative could be. A Room of One's Own made this explicit, tracing how women's exclusion from literary history wasn't about talent, but about access, about material conditions, about who got time and space and money to create. The argument seems obvious now, because she won it, because the ground shifted after she made the case. But it wasn't obvious in 1929. 3 Guineas pushed further, connecting personal and political, showing how domestic tyranny and international violence grew from the same root. The patriarchal structures that confined women also created the conditions for war. You couldn't address one without addressing the other. The establishment hated the book, found it extreme and unfair. She didn't care. She knew what she'd seen, knew the connections were real. The last years were hard. The war, the bombings, the constant anxiety, the sense that everything was falling apart. She kept working through it, kept trying to capture something essential, even as the world collapsed. Between the Acts is a strange, fragmented novel, because it was written during strange, fragmentary times. The pageant structure mirrors the chaos, history as performance, civilization as something that could end at any moment. She finished it knowing it might be her last book. The exhaustion was different this time, deeper, less recoverable. The voices were returning and she recognized the pattern, knew what was coming, knew she couldn't face it again. The decision to die was rational in its way, a clear-eyed assessment of what she could endure and what she couldn't. The note to Leonard is devastating because it's so calm, so considered, so full of love and gratitude. She wasn't angry or despairing. She was explaining, providing reasons, making clear that this wasn't about him, wasn't about anything he'd done or failed to do. The disease had won. She'd fought it for 46 years, and she was done fighting. Walking into the river with stones in her pockets was deliberate, final, chosen. She didn't want to be saved this time. She'd thought it through, knew what she was doing, knew it was the only way to stop the suffering. Whether she was right, whether given time she might have recovered again, that's unknowable and doesn't really matter. She believed it was necessary, and that belief was enough. The work survives. 9 novels, dozens of essays, short stories, reviews, criticism, thousands of pages of diaries and letters. It's an extraordinary output, created under extraordinary difficulties. Every sentence was earned through struggle, through the constant battle to stay functional enough to work, to maintain the concentration and discipline that writing demanded. She gave everything to the work, and the work remains. The sentences still pull you in, still create the consciousness she was trying to capture. The questions she asked about how to represent interior life, about what fiction could achieve, about how women's experiences could be written, these questions remain active, still generating responses and arguments. That's what lasts, not the tragedy, not the mythology, not the simplified version taught in schools. The actual work, complex and difficult and beautiful and strange. The vision of what literature could be if you were willing to break every rule and start fresh. The commitment to truth over convention, to innovation over safety, to capturing experience however messy and fragmented it might be. She changed what was possible, expanded the territory available to writers, demonstrated that women's interior lives mattered as much as men's public achievements, created forms that continue to influence how stories get told. That's the legacy. That's what survives. The work, always the work, speaking to readers she never met, in times she couldn't imagine, proving that what she built was strong enough to last.